Это известный продюсер, автор, если фильм перечислен. Я думаю, что все, кто здесь в зале находится, уже по интернету преимущественно ознакомились с его послужным списком. Как говорится, как на могиле Суворова написано просто Суворов. В данной ситуации у вас за стойкой известный продюсер Крисса Меледандри. Регламент у нас такой. Крис покажет сейчас, откроет вам свои самые страшные тайны. У него презентация на примере фильма, который вы, я надеюсь, посмотрели вчера или позавчера, в зависимости от того, у кого какие были возможности. И на примере еще пары фильмов, то, как он работает. Ну, а дальше в режиме вопрос-ответ у нас есть час или даже полтора, возможно. Let's start. Okay.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you all for coming this morning. I'm going to try to make sure that we get through the material and leave enough time for questions. So after I move through the material, please remember your questions if you have any. My own early experience in the film industry had absolutely nothing to do with animation. I actually started out working in live action filmmaking. When I was a child, I grew up without any animation exposure at all. I was taken to many, many films, live action movies as a child. I grew up on the American movies of the 1970s. So when I was 10 or 11 years old, I was seeing American movies like Midnight Cowboy or Easy Rider, but I wasn't seeing Bambi or Dumbo or any of the Disney movies. And in fact, I wasn't allowed to watch television, so I never saw any cartoons. It wasn't until I was in my 20s and I had my first son that I began to discover animation. And at that time, I was working on the production side of live action movies. I want to start with a little bit of background. And the background starts with, really starts with where do ideas come from? And the genesis of a movie like Ice Age actually came from a young group of executives whose job it was to look for new ideas. This was in the period of time in which we were developing new ideas for animated films, and some of my executives came to me and said, what if we make a film against the backdrop of the Ice Age? And that's really how it started. And then we began to flesh out the idea. We hired screenwriters and began to develop the script. Once we had the script, we had to figure out who was going to make the film. And this really goes to the whole notion of how we discover talent that makes our films, how we discover new directors. This was a period of time when Toy Story had come out, and there were a few other CG movies that were in development and production. And we at 20th Century Fox, we had experimented with traditional animation, having made 2 films. One was called Anastasia, and the other was called Titan AE. And we were looking for new talent to work with. And at that time, I saw some sequences from a movie that had not yet been released. It was the first movie that MTV produced. It was called Joe's Apartment. It was a terrible movie, but within the movie, they had sequences of these cockroaches who were performing dance numbers. And there were 4 or 5 of these sequences, and they were absolutely spectacular. I had never seen anything like it, and they had been done in CG animation. So I sought out the creators of those sequences who had worked for the director of the film, and that's when I found Chris Wedge and Blue Sky Studios. And based on that very early work, and based on just having seen those short sequences, we began a relationship that led to my bringing Chris the script of Ice Age and his directing the film. So in 2002, Ice Age came out. In 2004, we moved on and made our second CG animated film. By this time, we had partnered with Blue Sky, had built it from about 60 people to about 250, and we now purchased the studio. And then in 2000 and let's see here. Oh, in 2006, we made the sequel to Ice Age. In 2007, we supervised the Simpsons movie. And then in 2008, we made Horton. And then when I left in 2008, I left to form a new company to focus on animation with Universal Pictures, and that's when we created Illumination Entertainment. So I want to turn to Gatkiya, Despicable Me, and I want to go back to the idea of where do movie ideas come from. And with Gatkiya, I had just been in business with the new company about 1 month when a Spanish animator named Sergio Pablos came to see me. And Sergio had worked at Disney for many years as an animator, and then he had decided to return to his homeland, Spain, and start a small animation company. And he came and shared with me this idea that ultimately became Gatkiya. Now, what was unique about the pitch that he presented to me was that he had not only written out the basic storyline for the movie, but he had also illustrated the film as well. He had about 30 drawings, which really brought the core idea to life. And I want to share with you some of the drawings that he showed me. This was, roughly almost 3 years ago. I want to share with you some of these drawings, because for those of you who have seen the film, you'll recognize that there are moments from Sergio's original drawings, and Sergio did not write the screenplay, but there are moments from Sergio's original drawings that have actually ended up becoming the basis for scenes in the movie. That's how well he had thought out this story. So now the design you'll see is very different, but this is his conception of the character of Gru. This was one of the images that immediately made me laugh, and although it's been slightly reconceived for the film, it's the same essential idea of how to communicate the delight that Gru takes in doing things that are wicked. You know, this scene is actually quite literally a translation. Again, another sequence. The tea party. The girls making over his wild dog Kyle. The notion of the family tree that the girls write themselves into. And finally, the scene at the carnival, which is a very critical scene to the storytelling of the movie because it's really where Gru has his epiphany, and for the first time he recognizes that these girls have actually made an impact in his life. So it's a tribute to Sergio, who had never written a movie before and had never directed a movie. He was a very fine animator, that when he sat down to conceive this story, he had structured his story to such an evolved place that it really became the basis for our screenwriters. And the next step after meeting with Sergio was for me to find writers who could translate his story. And the way in which we worked at Illumination is we tend to be an extended creative family and tend to work with the same people more than one time, so that there's a fluidity to the creative process. And I brought in two screenwriters, Cinco Paul and Ken Dario, who had previously done the script of Horton with us. And they were extremely happy because Sergio had done so much of the heavy lifting of the work for them, and they came in and began to translate it into a movie. Now, for the directors, there were a couple of thoughts that I had in mind. One was that I had had great success and really had enjoyed the process of working with young directors. On Ice Age, it was Chris Wedge's first film as a director. He had directed lots of great animation and lots of great character animation for to be integrated into commercials. Later, we finished funding a short for him, but it was the first time he had directed a feature film, and with Carlos Saldana with Ice Age 2, the same thing, with the directors of Horton, the same thing. And there was just a vitality to the creative process when directors were coming to it with tremendous experience, but really taking on the role of helming a film for the first time. So I was very open and very eager to consider people who had not directed before. The second thing that occurred to me as I was thinking about directors was that Ice Age 2 came with a realization, which is the success of Ice Age 2 outside the United States was tremendous, and tremendous in relation to the success in the United States. It was still very successful in the United States, but it was working around the world in a way that was absolutely uncanny. And I was thinking about why that was, and it led me to realize that with animation being such a visual medium, being principally a medium that is about images more than anything else, that the fact that Carlos Saldanha was not American, English was his second language, had a real impact in truly driving the creative process to always use images as the solution to creative challenges rather than resorting to words. And the idea of continuing to find a key crew that was comprised of people from different cultures appealed to me. The massive undertaking of making an animated film has resulted in many successful collaborations where directors can shoulder the responsibility together. And I went down the path of a dual directing leadership. The first person I chose was a storyboard artist with whom I had worked at Fox and Blue Sky, named Chris Renaud. And Chris was an extraordinary storyboard artist. He had really been given the third act of Ice Age 2 by Carlos to tackle and figure out while Carlos was focusing on the first two acts. And we had also given Chris the opportunity to co-direct one of our Ice Age shorts, No Time for Nuts. So after having worked with Chris in this capacity, I was absolutely certain that he had the directorial capabilities to lead a film. And I introduced him to a French directing animator who I had met named Pierre Coffin. And Pierre had, my experience of seeing Pierre's work was very similar to my experience having seen Chris Wedge's work so many years earlier. I was in France and visiting studios, and a studio called MacGuff, where Pierre had done most of his work, showed me a reel, and on the reel were a number of very short films, very short pieces of animation that Pierre had directed. And once again, it was really through an immediate connection with his performance of the characters in these shorts that forged a connection. And it's always a very delicate balance when two directors who have never worked before together are paired and are asked to form a team. We had done this once before on Horton, and it had worked out very well. And fortunately, there was a mutual respect, but also complementary skills in that Chris came from a very strong story background and Pierre came from a very strong directing animation background. So when we jumped into the project, the screenplay was being written, we had turned to Carter Goodrich to design the characters. And just to touch on a couple of aspects of character design that always are challenging in CG for us, it's really the creation of a design that not only works flat, but also is a design that lends itself to a dimensional expression. And we went to Carter, who had designed characters for Ratatouille and had designed some Nemo characters and had done some design in Open Season, but whose work I had admired for a number of years. And in this case, we really were looking for experience, given this delicate translation from a flat design to a dimensional design. And I can't tell you how many times through the process of making these films that we have great satisfaction with a design in 2D, and then when it moves into 3D, we realize that the qualities that we were responding to in 2D just don't translate. But in this case, Carter's design really worked. And one of the other things that we had learned that we did a little differently from other studios, and we had learned this with Peter Desev on Ice Age, is the importance of maintaining the character designer's relationship to the movie through the modeling phases and even into the animation testing. Because there really is no better person to turn to when you're in the middle of modeling than the original character designer to really give guidance. And it just always surprised me how little interaction character designers had after their designs entered the 3D digital realm. Now, the challenge with designing Gru that Carter and Chris and Pierre faced was our movie having an antagonist, a supervillain, as the protagonist. And what that resulted in was a challenge where you needed a character design that had a certain innate appeal, but it also had, the character design had to have credibility as a character who possessed a threat. You had to believe that this character was actually a supervillain. But if you went too far in just designing the villain of all villains, you could very easily end up with a character who, with the best animation in the world, just had minimal appeal. So Carter went down many, many different paths, and then finally ended up in the realm of the silhouette of Gru. And when he found himself in this realm, the discussion was about, well, this guy is really appealing, but does he in fact have that credibility that he's a supervillain? And the feeling was that the heavier he was and the shorter he was, the more friendly and likable he was. But there was still a real attachment to his general feeling of shape. So the movement went from that shorter, squatter Gru up to a taller, leaner Gru. And as he got taller and as he got thicker rather than chubbier, the credibility in his villainy began to return. So just flipping through a couple of images. You know, one of the things that Chris Renaud had is always looking for in every character, principal character in the movie, is he's always looking for a distinguishing quality, a singular quality beyond the silhouette that defines the character. And I knew that our collaboration between Chris and Pierre was off to a really great start when Chris could describe this desire to find this singular characteristic, and Pierre, who is a lover of scarves, suggested the scarf as that feature. And when we landed on the scarf, we then also had to agree to expand our animation staff by 1.5 animators so that we would have somebody, we'd have the bandwidth to actually animate the scarf through the course of the movie without taking away from the other animation responsibilities. And then, of course, as the character design evolves, one critical factor is really to make sure that the individual designs coexist stylistically in the same world. You know, you go down such long paths trying to find each character design, and then frequently, when you bring them back together, you realize that some characters almost feel like they're coming from different films. Gru had a dog or a dog-like creature that Carter had designed, and the big challenge with this character, Kyle, was whether or not Kyle should be a speaking character or a nonverbal character. And for the longest time, he was actually a character, a creature who spoke. And ultimately, we moved away from that, which I personally was very happy with, because I think that the more nonverbal characters you can have in an animated film just gives you more opportunity for performance to be that dominant voice. Now, when we moved to voice casting for Gru, we went back to an actor that we had worked with on Horton, Steve Carell. Some of you may know him from The American Office. He was in a film recently that was released here called Date Night. And Steve embodied that vulnerability and likability in his voice. That was important, again, because our protagonist was a supervillain. We wanted something in the voice to communicate and encourage, engender an audience's empathy for the character. And that empathy is just embedded in Steve's vocal performance. Now, Steve came to this with a strong desire to create a voice, not to use a version of his own acting voice, his own voice. And he was driven by the belief that when he looked back at great villains from cinema, that he was always, his memory was always of the distinctive quality of their voices. And so he used as an influence, just as a jumping off point, the voice of Bela Lugosi as inspiration to find his voice. Now, when we came to casting the film in Russia, the objective was really twofold. One is to find actors who will take inspiration from the original voice acting, but will at the same time make it their own. So to achieve both things is a delicate balance. And again, for those of you who have seen the film, I can tell you from my perspective, just speaking about Gru, the expression of Gru done by Lennon is absolutely achieving that combination. It's very true to what the director's intent was for the film, but it's also uniquely his own. Now, with art direction, one of the principal guiding factors for art direction was creating a contrast between vector and Gru. So because these characters were competing in the film, the idea was to take that sense of competition and carry it over into the art direction of the film. So you had this spoiled, rich, young brat Vector who had everything that money could buy at his disposal, and you had the older Gru who was fighting to define his own legacy and fighting not to be upstaged by the young upstart. For art direction, we again created a teaming, a pairing of Yarrow Cheney, who is an American production designer from animated films, and Eric Guillaume, a French artist, who again was designing for the very first time. It was his first feature film. And he was charged with the principal designing of the environments. So I'm just going to click through some of the images that that convey that contrast in style. Goes into surfacing, and then defining a color palette. And as you'll see, the color palette of Gru, just like the design language of Gru, very much exists in contrast to Vector. So Vector's color palette was, much simpler, and his design language was almost this. It's almost both retro and futuristic at the same time. It's a wonderful quality that Eric has in his artwork. The interior of Vector's fortress, it was almost like it was designed by the designers that work at Apple. I mean, it was that really slick, clean lines, minimalistic. His ships as well, and even down to his ridiculous gadgets like his piranha gun. And again, you see the same style reflected in the influences for that were pulled, the design influences for surfacing. This is an example of a stage that we go through which is our color scripting phase, which is we create a color script for the entire movie, and in tremendous detail. And you can again see the contrast from the design working in this color script. Some of these processes, as you all know, most of these early ones are all overlapping, and which I know you're familiar with. This storyboarding, we approach storyboarding in a novel way for certainly any film that I had made. Every prior film that I had done, all the storyboard artists were gathered in one physical location. Given that we really were driven by trying to cast the absolute best story talent we could, who were best suited for this story and this tone, we did not restrict ourselves to having to find story artists who were all physically in Los Angeles in one location, and we ended up with story artists working in 4 different countries. We had a small group who storyboarded under Sergio Pablos's guidance in Spain. We had artists working in Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles we really went for artists ranging from artists who had worked on Family Guy and Simpsons all the way to artists that we had worked with previously at Blue Sky. And then we had some East Coast based and some Canadian based storyboard artists. And I was very confident that this was going to work because I was so confident in Chris Renault's own ability to storyboard, and knew that if there were disjointed elements, that Chris, being such a superb story artist for the film, over 25,000 individual storyboards, and just a couple of quick story images from breaking into vectors. So I'm going to just touch on layout, our staging phase, and I just want to talk about it really from the perspective of 3D. As most of you know, layout is what we call the stage, where the camera placement and the blocking of a scene, where we take the storyboards and we actually begin to move those storyboards into dimensional space. We have a very rough model, a blocking model of our set. We have blocking, very rough character models, and the directors set the character blocking and the camera movement. We were very fortunate to have an extraordinary artist running layout. His name is Kyle Balda. And Kyle had been actually at Pixar as a directing animator. And again, following this kind of theme of the movie giving people the first opportunity to do jobs that they had never done before, Pierre Coffin, who had worked with Kyle, called me and said, the good news is that Kyle Balda has decided to come and work with us on this film, and which was thrilling to us. It is very, very unusual for us to, for any studio to actually have artists who have, or voluntarily leave Pixar. It just doesn't happen that much. But the other part of it was that Pierre and Kyle wanted to give Kyle a shot at layout, which he had never done before. And in this case, Pierre's confidence in him really became the determining factor. And what was fantastic is that in layout, where you just don't expect much character performance at all, Kyle, being a directing animator, found ways to create so much character performance in the staging phase that actually went on and really influenced the animation phase. But it is really in the layout stage where the first design of 3D comes into play. Obviously, the artists are working already in dimensional space, but this is really the place where if you want 3D to be a fully organic part of the expression of the film, that the staging now begins to take place with the contemplation of 3D, which can present certain challenges, because you frequently find yourselves with choices that you have to make, which is, are you going to stage for the 3D expression of the scene, or are you going to stage for the 2D expression? And that's a balancing act that the filmmakers walk throughout the film, that not only affects the staging, but also affects many other facets, such as the editorial rhythms of the film as well. So, just a couple of images. Here's the rough model of Gru, and the rough model of Vector. But this is an example where the performance choice of Vector rubbing the keyboard against his bottom is something that wasn't in the script, but came about through the staging phase, through layout, and throughout the film. There are many details of performance that actually were conceived in the layout phase. Can anybody give me a time check, just so I have enough time for questions? Okay. So, moving into modeling and rigging, and now, so this is the character of Perkins. Almost everybody now is working in ZBrush for the modeling. Mike DeFeo, who was our amazing sculptor and head of modeling at Blue Sky, who would make the most beautiful clay models on all the Ice Age characters and on Horton. He recently, other than for his own personal work, he recently abandoned clay and went to ZBrush. So it's almost exclusively now, most American modelers that I'm familiar with just go right into the digital space for modeling. Then obviously we move into the rigging phase. This character was particularly challenging in rigging because the desire was to have him be both very, very stiff and also very fluid at the same time. That because he's the banker and he's ultimately the true bad guy in the film, there was a coldness and a stiffness which was carried through really very little movement in his clothing, but he obviously had to have life in him as well, which demanded both simultaneously fluidity and stiffness. So, moving on to animation testing, of all of the parts of the production process, for me, I think that animation testing is just one of the most vibrant parts of the creative process. Because for us, we've really chosen to make character the central focus of films. That everything comes from character. Even story is there to support character. And that period of time where the character comes to life is obviously in animation testing. And what we have found on every single film is that the creative work done by the animation team, when they have no quota demands, is really some of the most extraordinary character-defining work. That once quota demands come into play, no matter how low they are, even if you're ramping up and saying, okay, we're going to start, we're going to start our testing through a period where we have very low quota. Obviously, through the rigging process, you have to be working with the animation team, but we have decided to really isolate a period of time. Maybe not the entire animation team. Entire animation team at its height in a film like Gadkiya would be 45 character animators. So right now we're in storyboarding on our next fully animated film called The Lorax. And we have about a 4-month period where we have a team of 20 animators who have no quota and are just working and playing with characters. Now, for us, that's a real luxury, but it is probably the most critical part of the film where the personalities are really going to be defined. Here was a very slow walk cycle for the character of Perkins. He eventually ended up moving a little bit more quickly. I view this, one of the trends that's happened in live action filmmaking in the US is the loss of rehearsal. That a number of years ago, it was absolutely mandatory that every film had at least 2 weeks of rehearsal before shooting started. And now you find rehearsal going down to 1 or 2 days. But it's the need for, and given the choice, I would say there should be 2 months of rehearsal. So we've been able to institute our own performance rehearsal period. And this facial test here was originally done as much as part of the checking and final approval of rigging as it was to just begin to define the parameters of expression. First, really see how expressive that face can be, and then move in and begin to define the expression of personality that defines the character of Gru. Here was a very early test that was done.
Number 3, you will not cry, or whine, or laugh, or giggle, or sneeze, or burp, or fart. So no annoying sounds, right?
So actually taking a few scenes and even just beginning to play with them before they actually are needed for quota. So as we quickly just move through surfacing and lighting, because I want to have time for questions, I want to really just make one central point, which is that the designs that were done by our environmental designer who I talked about earlier, Eric Guillaume, they were met with such enthusiasm by our directors, and that what the goal became trying to capture as much of his original drawings in both the composition, the surfacing, and the lighting. And so it wasn't that it was a dictatorial process, it was that the strength of these drawings was just so unusually extraordinary that defined.
О кастинге актеров на озвучивание ваших фильмов и о длительности, сложности и важности этого процесса. Большое спасибо.
The voice casting is an absolutely critical part of the definition of personality. So if you go back to what I said earlier, which is that our films are driven by character, and character is the most important creative guide defining character in making the movie. The characters themselves and their personality in our films become a collaboration. Defining character becomes a collaboration between character designer, the directors, the directing animator, the writers, in this case, even Sergio, who came up with the story. And then the last piece is the voice actor. So they're all bringing their contribution to defining the expression of personality. And so we take quite a long time in discussing actors and experimenting with their voices. We spend months and months taking voices from other films that, performances, and just putting those performances from another movie up against the images of our actors. Sometimes we may even do some simple storyboards to match the acting in the track that we've taken, just to begin to live with the fit between the voice and the actor. And then what happens, no matter how much work has gone into the character in terms of the directors and the screenwriters and all the designers, the animators and the voice actor come in roughly at the same time. So our experimental animation is starting just as the voice actors are being cast. And the growth of personality, of expression that occur when you bring in the animators and the voice actors is absolutely, in most cases, transformative.
Lev Zemlinsky, music composer. Could you tell us, please, at what stage of do you hire the composer? At what stage do you begin to work with him? And who works with composer mostly? You as a producer or directors? And how much time do you give to music composing? Thank you.
It's an excellent question, because it's really a distinction between how live action movies are made in the United States and how we make animated movies. Live action movies traditionally will bring the composer in during post-production after the completion of shooting, and then the composer will be given a number of weeks or a few months to compose the score, really working from the director's first cut of the movie. What we do is we, in most of our films, have brought the composer in very, very early. We bring the composer in when we really are still in the screenwriting phase. And I've been fortunate to work with one composer, John Powell, on a number of different films. And John has, he worked with us on Robots, Ice Age 2, Horton, and now he's doing our next film, Lorax. And we are in the storyboarding phase, and John's been on for 3 or 4 months. It is a particular challenge, though, for a composer, because you don't want the composer to get exhausted to the point where it impacts their ability to be really imaginative. And what John explains to me, having now been working on our 4th film, is that through the animation process, our scenes change so constantly, so fluidly, that he has to protect himself from rescoring a scene 7 or 8 times. So what you really try to do is you really try to limit the composer's work to themes. And yet the directors, and especially when you're working with young directors, even myself as a producer, and even John, the temptation when you're working with themes is, well, that sounds like a wonderful theme, but how would that work against a scene? And you get down on this slippery slope where all of a sudden he started out just writing a theme, but to really show how the music's going to work, he's already now scoring a sequence, and that sequence is going to change 7 times, and it becomes not just a question of a lot of work, it becomes a question of his wanting to be as inspired as he can when he actually sits down to create what's going to be the final expression for that scene. So just to answer your last question, this really means that a composer is on our film for at least 18 months to 2 years, although they come and go. So he's still working on other films, other live action films, but reserves the periodic time to continue through that 2-year period.
Добрый день. Крис, Марина Лескова, студия Фрода. У меня вопрос к вам как к продюсеру, который работает в основном, как я поняла, после анестезии в формате 3D. Вас интересуют проекты двухмерные? Если бы вам попался интересный двухмерный проект полнометражного фильма, вас бы это заинтересовало?
We are going to work in other mediums of animation, and I expect that we will make another 2D film. We're right now focusing on a stop-motion movie. There's no question that 2D is a challenging animation form in the United States for a big, broad audience movie. Now, having said that, I had the pleasure of supervising the Simpsons movie, which was, we had a lot of 3D elements, but it was essentially a 2D film. Obviously there you have the genesis of the project being in 2D. You know, if I was able to be involved in a Miyazaki film, I'd cut off my arm to make a Miyazaki film in 2D. So I think that we currently do not have any 2D projects that we're working on. But I expect that the right project will come along with the right filmmaker who has a vision that's in 2D, and we will back that when that happens.
Hello, Nadezhda Markalova, The World of 3D magazine. Was this movie conceived as a 3D movie? And could you tell us about the challenges of making a 3D movie, writing it in the script and building the scene composition and so on?
Well, the movie, the decision to do the film in 3D happened as we were in storyboarding, heading to layout. And there are, I did an interesting experiment about 6 years ago. I took 3 sequences from robots and rendered the second eye. And just to see what the imagery would feel like. And with no fixes, the only thing that we did was render the second eye. And the sequences were surprisingly successful and immersive. And it was that's when I realized what is really almost the obvious, which is that with CG animation, the artists are already working in dimensional space. Everything is being built dimensionally. And it is a medium that so lends itself to a 3D projection and experience for the audience. So we started in the layout phase, which precedes animation. And some of the challenges, well, I'll just pick one to discuss now. One is the editorial challenge. And the editorial challenge is a challenge where your shortcuts can be very, very disruptive in 3D. So it begins to affect your editing rhythms of the film. And you may want to cut for the, for story. But if you're in 3D, you have to bring that consideration to the forefront, as well as this difference in staging in between cuts, because you can very quickly find yourself in a place where your cuts become, where your quick cutting ends up resulting in the 3D being very intrusive and almost disturbing. So there are a number of challenges. There's a rendering challenge, obviously, because you're rendering so much more. But having said that, the challenges are relatively minor when you compare how organic the work that's already being done in making a CG movie is, how organic it is to a 3D expression.
Крис, что, на ваш взгляд, должно быть главным для детей в мультфильме? Что, на ваш взгляд, должно быть главным для детей в мультфильме?
Well, I think that I actually think that it's the same for all audiences, and I think the most important thing in an animated film is the expression of character. It's the actual performance that the animator